Okay, we're very excited to have Sarah Benkirane today. She's going to talk to us about change within the curling club, bringing inclusion. And this is a topic that I know I'm personally very excited about, and I know all of us are wanting to learn more about this. So thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Monica mentioned the title of the talk. Talking about today specifically what we can change within the curling club, what's in our power as members of curling clubs, people who have vested interests in curling, to see what we can do to especially center experiences of marginalized and racialized communities, and create the change that we want to see in the curling clubs. And so this is not working. I will talk a little bit about myself. So I am currently in Montreal, in Canada. I am doing my PhD in cross-cultural psychology, which is a subfield of social psychology. And my research really focuses on access to mental health care services for marginalized communities. And so specifically, I look at social barriers and social inclusion to access to mental health care services. And different, over the years of doing this research, have kind of expanded into looking at social inclusion more generally. And so this talk will very much have a lens of social psych and intergroup and group relations. So that's definitely the perspective, at least from a research side of things, that I come from. I also was a competitive curler for many years in Canada, especially on the junior circuit, playing around Quebec a lot and also around Canada and a little bit in other countries. And this talk and my passion has really been informed by a first-person experience of wearing the hijab as a competitive curling in Canada on the curling circuit about 10 years ago. And I also identify as somebody who's Moroccan Canadian, and so grappling with not being part of a marginalized community within a curling club when 10 years ago and still today the curling club is a very white place. And understanding what that means, for myself walking into a curling club, but also what it means for my family and for my friends talking about curling and their stereotypes that they have about curling, and really informs my understanding of what I'll be presenting today. But then also acknowledging that there are a lot of privileges that I have. I've spent a lot of time in school studying this, and I work a job where I get to do this every day, and there are a lot of privileges that come with what I do. And so speaking from a place from understanding, but also understanding that I'm definitely not, the only person who has experienced marginalization in a curling club. And so keeping that in mind is this, this is a very personal experience, this is a very personal talk, but in no ways does it represent, the diversity of what the experiences are of folks around the world. And so I wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that my home is located on unceded Indigenous land. So Montreal has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, Mohawk, and St. Lawrence Iroquoian. I seek to honor and continue the exchange of traditions by continuing to contribute to Montreal's diverse community. And this talk will very much focus on racialized groups, and that includes Indigenous populations. I unfortunately haven't had the firsthand experience of working with a lot of Indigenous populations, but I do want to make sure that we're actively thinking about inclusion for Indigenous and marginalized populations, and would love to continue that chat. Maybe not in this talk, but open definitely the floor of discussion of inclusion for Indigenous communities. And so for the presentation today, I thought a lot. I've redone this presentation a couple of times, and I've thought a lot about, what is the best way to get the message out, thinking about who is attending, and I've broken it down into two sections. So first section is talking about theory and, realizing that a lot of people have probably come to this talk for practical tips about inclusion in the curling club, and we will get to it. But I think one of the things that I really care a lot about is that language is power. And I want people here today, but also watching the recording, to be able to talk about these issues in a meaningful way. And there are a lot of, big words, a lot of deep and meaningful words and language around the issue of diversity. And so taking some time at the beginning of the talk to talk about what those terms mean to me and how I talk about them in my surrounding from a social psych lens, and hopefully, equipping this group with the ability to talk about diversity in a way that makes sense to others, and then in your curling club. So that's really the first part, just setting kind of ground rules, ground framework, equipping you all with the language to talk about diversity and inclusion. And so we'll talk about some key terms. We'll talk about, what is a group, how, why is the curling club the way it is? How is it so tight knit? Some of those things. Talk a little bit about theory behind discrimination and microaggressions. And what does grassroots change mean? It's definitely, a topic that we've seen a lot in the last year, but how do we affect grassroots change? And then we'll go into a little bit more practical considerations. So how you as an individual can contribute to some of these efforts, talking about changing the culture within a club, and then some of the practical considerations that you can take away and think about. I don't anticipate this talk will take a whole hour, but I'm excited that it seems that we have enough people that we can maybe do some breakouts to talk amongst each other about some of these tough questions. When I was writing this talk, I was thinking like, oh, there's no way I'm going to give everybody the answers that they want to hear. There is no right answer. And so informed by my experience, I'm so excited to be able to talk to everyone here today about your own experiences in the club. And my view of things is very Canadian centric. I know what it looks like to be in a curling club in Canada, but I don't know a lot about what it looks like to be in a curling club across the world. And so excited to hear what that, are there similarities, are there differences, are there the same struggles? Are there things we need to be thinking about that we haven't thought about? And so excited to have that chat with you all at the end. And so we'll start off by defining some key terms. And so when I'm talking about key terms, and the presentation in general is very much from a social justice lens. And so when we talk about social justice, we're talking about equal access to wealth and opportunities and privilege within a society, and specifically groups who have traditionally not had the same opportunities for various reasons. And so we want to make sure that we're centering those with lived experience. And so the two terms I want to talk about first are marginalization. And so marginalization, interestingly, if we look at the definition of marginalization in the dictionary, it says to write notes in the margins. And I think that image, although is not the way we talk about it from a social, sociology or psychology perspective today, it's a really good image of understanding, you have these notes that are really important. They're in the margins of your textbook, or clearly I've been in school for a long time, but I write notes in the margins, but they're not part of the body of the text. And there's this segregation that exists between those written notes and what's printed in the book. And so that to me has really helped me understand the visualization of what marginalization is, and how it applies to societies. And so when we think about marginalized communities, we think about groups or people, typically ethnic or cultural minorities, that are placed in a position of lesser influence, lesser power, lesser importance. But importantly, and I'm going to bring this point up a lot, I will bring this point up a lot. We want to make sure, so when we talk about marginalization and racialization, one of the things that is important is to remember that the onus is on the society, on the structure of our communities, and it's not on the individuals. A person doesn't, walk into a society and decide that they want to exist at the margins of the society. And so using this language for me is really important, because we want to make sure that people are taking responsibility for the social dynamics that exist today and how that has had an impact unjustly on some communities. And so racialization is another important word that I will use a lot, but the formal definition would be groups that come to be designated as part of a particular race, and then on the basis of being part of that race are treated differentially or unequally. And again, here the focus is really on society's treatment of these people who are not, choosing or by any volition part of these groups, but are treated lesser than because that's the way society has operated for a very long time. The other terms that I wanted to talk about are diversity, access, inclusion, and equity. And so, we hear, especially in the last year since, the explosion of BLM in the US, we hear a lot of these words: DEI, IDEA. There's acronyms that exist. There are tons of acronyms that exist. And they're words that seem to be quite simple, but when we dive into them a little bit more, they're complex. And the definitions that I'll provide are not, the be all end all definitions, but the ones that I really have taken to heart and adopted in this framework. And so when we're talking about diversity, for me, we're talking about a relational and dynamic concept. And stressing the word relational for me here is really important, because somebody doesn't exist as, or it's not the right use of the term diverse in my eyes to say somebody is diverse. We shouldn't say Sarah is diverse. We have a community that is diverse. We have diversity within a social group. And so talking about diversity within a group makes a lot more sense to me personally, but also from a social psych lens. And it also means that the understanding that we're surpassing a simple tolerance of people or of differences, and really ensuring that we value those differences and understanding that differences are part of the makeup of our society. And the other thing with diversity that I'm calling out is considering the intersections of marginalization that exist. So for example, somebody who identifies as part of the LGBTQ community and who also identifies as a racialized person might not experience the world in the same way as somebody who's part of one or the other of those groups. And so talking about diversity from an intersectionality lens is something that I would love to talk a little bit more about, but that is to keep in mind as we go through this presentation. The second key term is access. And so the way we define access, or the way I define access, is ensuring that those who face the most barriers are the ones who inform our best practices. And the goal is that they are able to fully participate, connect, and engage in all aspects of an organization, of a service, without barriers or without obstacles. And so access, traditionally access talks a lot about, able-bodied folks, and the conception in curling is, well, we have wheelchair curling, so we're fine. And I think, one, that's a very simplistic view, and two, access to me extends beyond, able-bodied folks, but also talking about, socioeconomic status and community marginalization that makes it hard for some communities disproportionately to access curling clubs. The point that I want to talk about for inclusion is that we want to make sure that when we're talking about inclusion, that folks have the ability to be part of the decision-making process, and for a lot of times thinking about having a seat at the table for those big decisions. And so not only inclusion as, oh yeah, we have some racialized folks in our club, but are those people informing the decisions that we're making? Are they making, are we informing the way that we're running our clubs or our centers as a way that is truly inclusive of their needs of some of these communities? And the last word is equity. And I like to show this diagram for equity because I think it makes an important distinction between equality and equity. We hear a lot in my line, I work as the director of a service at Kids Help Phone in Canada. And, I hear a lot of, well, it's the reverse of favoritism, or it's the reverse of discrimination when you're hiring folks from various backgrounds who don't have the same educational experience. And actually, I think a lot of that stems from not understanding the difference between equality and equity. There are populations that have been historically and still today so disproportionately marginalized, and that would be unfair to give them, as this picture would look like, the same height stool as somebody who is taller. And so thinking about equity in a lens that we want to make sure that everybody has equal opportunity, but that doesn't mean we necessarily have to provide them with the same things to start off. And so I will hop into what is very much my bread and butter in terms of social psychology. So I look a lot at group functioning, and I don't know why social psychologists have not caught on to the curling club yet, because it is such a fun example of what group functioning is, and understanding intergroup relations and also intra-group relations. And so I will give you all a short look into group functioning and understanding a little bit of the basics of social psychology that go into the curling clubs that we have today. And so I realize I'm bombarding everybody with definitions, but hopefully they're palatable. So when we define a group, there are 4 key characteristics that we look at. The first is norms, and we're going to get back to this, but norms typically are defined as a set of rules that tell individuals how to behave in a certain setting. And so specifically, we'll look at social norms and how those norms influence how people act within a group. We also talk about roles in a group setting. So, if we think about a curling club, there's the president of the curling club. There are those who sit on the board. There are also those who teach junior curling on Saturdays, or Saturdays for us at least. And thinking about how those roles have a differential impact on the structure of the club. There's also often a communication structure. So how do we talk? How do we address people in the club? What kind of language are we, what kind of level of language that we talk about? Are there words that we can and can't say? Are there things that we can and can't do? And the last is a power structure, and understanding, that as part of any group, not just a curling club, there are different levels of power that are embedded in the way groups function, but also being able to call out some of those power structures and making sure that the people who hold those positions of power can advocate for folks who maybe don't have a voice or have not traditionally been able to have a voice. And so the question that I come to the group with is, what do you think when you hear someone say curling club? And I'm going to try and share my screen. We'll see if this works. Can everybody see? It should say Menti. So if you feel comfortable, if you go to this website and enter this code, we're going to generate a word cloud that we'll be able to save. And I think it'll be interesting to look at the end of the presentation, thinking of, what are your, just stereotypically thinking about your curling club, but also like a curling club in the abstract. I'll give you a couple of minutes. Hopefully this works. Monica, maybe you can be the scapegoat and try it out for me.
Yeah, so we're going to www.menti.com and we're entering the code. So that came up for me, and it just gives me a bunch of places to enter a word. So cool. If everybody could take a second and just participate in this, and as we go through the presentation, add to it more. Is that your plan, Sarah?
I think let's try like 2 minutes. It will generate, as soon as somebody types the word in, it will pop up on the screen. So let's try and generate a word cloud now. If you don't or can't, maybe also they can put it in the chat, and Monica, you can populate it. There we go. Awesome. Oh, awesome. These are fun. We do these a lot. I teach a class in university, and we do word clouds all the time, and it's the most fun thing for the students. So I thought I'd try it out with this group. And what you'll see is the words that are in larger font is probably because more than one person has entered the word. So fun, for example, has been entered by more than one person, and it'll show up as larger. So maybe give everybody another 30 seconds to think about some of the things. Awesome. Awesome. Okay, cool. I'm excited that this worked. It's interesting because I think about the curling club, and I talk about the curling club a lot as, some of these words: fun, home away from home, a community. And for a long time, before I started to, before I was in grad school talking about clinical psychology, cross-cultural psychology, I was I loved being, I have never found, and I talk about this a lot, I have never found something that I love as much as I love curling. And if, it feels like home, and I get the warm and fuzzies when I think about going to the club, and being on the ice is unparalleled. Like, I cannot find a place that I'm happier than I am on the ice. And then I thought about it some more, and I was like, well, I want this for everybody. I want everybody to be able to experience the joy that I experience when I'm on the ice. And so this word cloud is really cool, because it reminds me of all the good things. And when you get into this work, you can also start thinking about all the difficult things and all of the things, there's some words that come up here as, white, which something drinks, and something that's expensive. And I see those, and I remind myself that those are real barriers to people accessing this sport that I love so much. And these ideas is really what fuels, I think, what I do, and what Monica and Sarah and are trying to do with this initiative is bring that joy that we have and we're talking about in curling to more folks, and make sure that it's a place that is welcoming to most, or not to most, but to all. And so let's see if this works. All right. I'm going to tell you the 3 things that I think about when I think about the curling club. Caricaturing a little bit because it's for the presentation. But I think about drinks after the club. I think about potlucks. And I think about a lot of white folks. And that maybe makes you uncomfortable to hear. And it's okay. I think one of the things, that I could have started the presentation off by saying is a lot of these topics may make you feel uncomfortable. You might be, realizing these things for the first time, or just grappling with the fact that this is the environment that we're in. And it's okay. Actually, I think if you listen to this presentation, you didn't feel any sort of weird feelings inside or some tough feelings, then we wouldn't accomplish the goal. We can't actually make this sustainable and big changes that we need to be making if it's something that you feel super comfortable with. And so I'll stop here and talk a little bit about my lived experience. And so I identify as somebody who's part of the Muslim community, and I remember when I was a kid and we used to travel for bonspiels on the weekends, especially, when I was competing, we would be away weekend after weekend, and there would be potlucks put on by various communities. And I remember all the times that I, sat at the table and couldn't eat, the main meal because it was tourtière, which is a Quebec kind of French meat pie. And it was made with food that I couldn't eat. And that was one of the very first times that I thought about curling as something that could be exclusionary. And thinking, everybody's enjoying this meal together, talking about the food, and there's nothing for me. And so there's these very small things, and we'll talk about what that is from a psych perspective, but there are these things that make it feel like home, make it feel like a community, but at the same time can also make you feel like an outsider when you're in the curling club. The same thing for alcohol. We'll talk, or I'll skip to the next slide, but I think we'll talk a little bit about, the culture around drinking in curling, and that can be really exciting and fun and something to hang out on a Friday night, and it can also be something that is inherently exclusionary. And so I wanted to stop and talk a little bit about social norms. And so social norms are unwritten rules of behavior that are expected in a group or society. And so social norms are positive, and I'm going to talk about them in maybe a little bit more of a negative light, but they're the reason that groups work. Because of social norms, you know how to behave in spaces. You're not consistently anxious about your behaviors. You come to understand what is expected of you, and it allows us to operate at this less than anxious state 24/7. Conversely, if you're not familiar with the social norms, then you're walking into a place where everybody knows what they're doing and you have no idea what you're doing. And so even though nobody is telling you that you don't belong, the vibe is the word that comes to mind, makes you feel like you don't belong. And so that, from a psych perspective, and I would encourage folks to look into this a little bit more, but the idea that social norms kind of shape the behaviors that we have, but also shape some of the exclusionary practices that we have, is an important concept to start thinking about. And so one of the norms that I think about is, and I don't know, I told this to somebody and they said, oh, we don't do that at our club, but at our club at least, when after a game, the winner buys the losing team a drink, or, and I play lead and the lead buys the lead a drink, and so on and so forth. And so if you think about that, it's super generous and is very cool. And then you think a lot about, I remember when I was a student and it was tough to, make ends meet, period. And then, I had to go to the curling club, and if I was playing in 4 nights a week because I needed to, I needed the practice ice and there were leagues that I'm paying for, and, hopefully and also excitingly we win. Well, then you're paying for yourself and somebody else's drink 4 times a week. And so then, somebody mentioned the word cloud, curling is expensive. So yeah, curling is expensive because the membership is expensive, but it's also expensive because we're spending a lot of money on alcohol. And so that's one piece of it is, from a socioeconomic standpoint, are there communities that are being excluded because of some of these traditions? And are there ways that we can start talking about it to make it at least, it doesn't mean we are saying, no, nobody can buy drinks for anybody anymore. But is there a way to make it so that the norm is so strong that if you're not doing it, you're kind of feeling bad about it? And the same thing when we're talking about drinking, there are a lot of times where people will say, that I've said, no, I'm not going to have a drink. And there's those kind of probing questions or why, or, and so then, consistently feeling like people are questioning your behaviors, the way you're experiencing, something that's supposed to be fun can also be inherently exclusionary. So, there are things that we can do that, and we'll talk about practices that are easy to change. That question, those questions of, is there something I can get you to, can I get you a soda? Or can we talk a little bit more about, diversifying what the after curling experience is, knowing that curling is quite unique in the fact that the social aspect is almost as or more, more valuable for a lot of folks than the experience on the ice. And so how do we make sure that that social piece is something that people get to, that attracts people to the club and makes them want to feel like that they can be part of this group? An interesting research that has come out really recently, end of last year, was looking at the promotion of pro-diversity norms and pro-inclusive attitudes. And what that means is that, so pro-diversity norms is starting to shape the way we talk about diversity, or embedding the way we talk about diversity into our day-to-day practices. So it's not enough for one time to see one racialized person. It needs to be something that we're immersed in, and that people who are not familiar with diversity are immersed in. And so in this study that came out last year, this was a study at a university that was traditionally very white. And with the students, they started using messaging and posters and videos that were embedded and informed by the diverse set of students that were there. And what they saw is that after a semester of having these videos, these posters, these messages, really encouraging diversity in an in-depth and explained way, the attitudes of the white students became much more pro-inclusivity and encouraging of marginalized communities to be part of this university setting. And so, this is recent research in there. I am very conscious as a social psychologist about replication, making sure that this is something that we can prove over and over again before we state it as a fact. But I do think that it's hopeful that there are things that we can do like this that are low lift in a sense, that can change the landscape of what we're seeing in our curling clubs. And one note here is, avoiding tokenism. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we do not want to have that one racialized person who is a spokesperson for your curling club, or, every time a racialized person comes in, you're like, oh, Sarah, go say hi to them. You must know what it's like. And so really here talking about norms is that it needs to be able to have effective social change, you need to have folks that are embedded in the norms, and that it's something that people are seeing consistently and are socialized into. The other thing that I want to talk about is group membership. And so we'll do one more word cloud. I promise this is the last. But I want to know, who are the members of your club? So maybe that's twofold. You could talk about their role within the club, but then also, who are they as people? Who are the people that come to mind? Maybe it's their job. Maybe it's, what they do, who they are. And so I'll share this again. This should work. Let's see. No. How do I move on? Okay, let's try this. There will be a code that is generated. There you go. Maybe it's the same code. But I'll give you again another like 2 minutes to put in some of the things that come into mind when you think about curling clubs or the people in your curling club. Not in the context of this presentation, I would love to hear who said like grumpy/angry and what that looks like. I think I can see it, but I'd love to hear more about that. Mm-hmm. All right. One of the cool things that we get to do with these polls while I'm waiting for people to finish is when I've had the chance to do, a couple of these talks, and one of the things that we do is we print screen with these and have people bring them back to their, so I did a workshop recently at a corporate job, and there was definitely a dissonance between what the employees felt and what senior leadership was saying. And so what we did is we print screen this Menti poll, and we brought it back to senior leadership, and we were able to show tangibly, look, this is what your employees generated. This is how they're feeling. These are the words that they've come up with. Can we talk about change now? And so this, and there are ways to do it in a less confrontational way, but taking away taking away some of these words and thinking about what other people have put in the chats and bringing them back to your curling club and saying, listen, we're talking about diversity, our governing bodies are saying, we're diverse, we're inclusive. Yet this is what comes up when we talk about diversity. When somebody asks me who the members of our club are, this is what comes up. It means we're not doing enough. And using our understanding as leverage and power, I think can be something that's really powerful. And so I will screenshot this and send it over to Monica. But I encourage you to think about these words and about the way you see the clubs, especially if you're part of a group that has been historically privileged or is privileged. How do you impact the change and advocate for these people? And we'll talk about what being an ally means. But yes, these are also things that I think about a lot. I think a lot about white, older, middle class or middle upper class, somebody who, affluent. And so I will go back, I will go back to my presentation. So when we talk about group membership, we talk typically about 3 aspects. The first is status. And so that's status within the group, but also groups tend to be formed of people who are of the same socioeconomic status, which can be dangerous because like we see, curling clubs will attract the middle to high class affluent folks. And it will continue to attract those middle to high affluent folks because groups tend to attract people who are similar in socioeconomic status. And, again, we'll talk a little bit later about what the changes we can do to start deconstructing that. But I think understanding that is a tendency in all groups is something, is a good baseline to understand, okay, this is the norm and this is what we need to change. We also talk a lot about active and passive membership. And so, when you think about active membership, we think about volunteers and we think about members of the board and we think about the people who are there, maybe the bartender who's there very often. And then we think about passive membership, people who come in, who play their league game and who leave or stay for one drink and leave. And just understanding that there are different roles within a group and both of them are really valued. Sometimes passive membership or arguably passive membership is the most powerful driver of change. It's probably the majority of folks in a club, are not screaming the loudest or not advocating the most. But that's where the really grassroots change starts. And then also, active membership, on the other hand, we need those folks on board to be able to create change, but understanding that maybe we're talking to these people differently, maybe active members, we need to finesse our language a little bit more. People who have been embedded in the same curling club for 50 or 60 years. And how do we start talking about changing the curling club versus somebody who's passive and maybe doesn't have a vested interest in this. And like, as we know, curling clubs, but curling becomes part of your identity. And so when you're attacking a curling club, or what feels like an attack to a curling club, it will feel to the person who is an active member as an attack to their identity. And we need to be able to deconstruct what identity is from what the curling club is. We can say that there are inherent problems with a curling club without saying you're a bad person. And talking about that language to somebody, especially those who have so much interest in the success of a curling club, is really important. And then the other thing we talk about is that groups, like when talking about status, there is homogeneity to a group. Groups tend to have a lot of similar characteristics, and that's how you feel, at home. If you look around and you see people who are like you, or who talk like you, or who act like you, you will feel welcome. And so, understanding that there is a necessity to having homogeneity, how do we start breaking that down? And also that means understanding that having one or two racialized folks will not change. When more racialized folks come in, suddenly they will feel included because there's one more person who looks like them. We need to start understanding how we can make the homogeneity fit the larger picture of the group, and also changing kind of what the landscape of the group looks like. And so we talked about, those first slides were a lot about intra-group relations. So within the group, what is happening? There's also, a whole literature on intergroup relations, so between groups. And specifically, I wanted to spend just one slide talking about acculturation. And so this is definitely the research field that I spend the most time in. Acculturation typically happens when you have two groups that are different, different in different reasons. I look a lot from an immigration perspective. So I look at people who are newcomers to the country and how they interact with the mainstream group, so long-standing Canadians. But that can be applied, very well to the curling club. And so the ideal and what we see for best well-being outcomes, most happiness, is people who are integrated. And we hear a lot about integration, but we don't necessarily know what integration means. And so from a social psych perspective, what we want is somebody who can maintain some of the traditions, some of the culture, some of the identity with their heritage group, and, an adaptation to a new group. And so from really a behavioral perspective, I can think about, I feel integrated as a Canadian because I get to talk about Morocco all the time, and those things that I found cool living in Morocco, and I get to sell, I have such a sense of pride when I watch the Olympics and I see the Canadian flag. And so being able to integrate those two parts of who I am into something that's cohesive and, identify as a Moroccan Canadian is seen in the literature to be very encouraging for well-being, as opposed to somebody who feels like they need to separate their two identities. So I can only be Moroccan at home and I can only be Canadian at work, but I can never be both at the same time because people won't accept me. And so the reason I'm introducing this is because at the curling club perspective, I think the idea that we can just absorb a group into our larger group that is a curling club won't work. The people won't be happy. We know that marginalization or separation tend to lead to lower well-being. And so there is a flexibility that needs to happen on the folks in the curling clubs end to start thinking about how do we, it's not a one-way street. It's not for the newcomers to adapt to us and not, we stay as is and they adapt to us. It should be, how do we also change some of our practices to mold to the new reality? How do we become curious about some of the things and the practices that are important to these folks who are walking into our curling club? Can we sell? And some small things that we see in literature have a big impact are things like celebrating, important holidays. And so as opposed to having a Christmas potluck, is there a way to have a Hanukkah Christmas potluck? Or can we talk about what Ramadan is? And can we have a celebration like that? And starting to understand and really treasure and value practices of other members of the community who want to be a part of the club will inherently make them more happy, feel more included, feel more welcome, and ideally lead to integration, which would be a meshing or a combination of the two cultural practices as opposed to a separation. Food for thought. I hope everybody has time to go take a nap after this, because I know it's a lot of theory. The other thing I want to talk about from a social psych perspective, and then we can start talking about practice, is talking about discrimination and microaggressions. And so it's interesting, I think, when I think about a lot of curling clubs and folks who I know from curling, and I can almost confidently say that most of them are not inherently, the vast majority are not inherently discriminatory. But there are these little comments that make you second guess, well, if this is somewhere you should be, or if this is somewhere where you should feel comfortable. And that's very much the term, microaggression. And so it's these small comments that people are making that on the surface might not feel like anything, but actually, make a huge difference in the long run for those who are receiving. And so there are 3 types of microaggressions. The first are micro assaults. And so micro assaults are usually when somebody, intentionally behaves in a discriminatory way and then after kind of takes it back. So, somebody will make a racist joke and say, no, I was just, and, they'll see that you're not laughing and then they'll say, well, I'm just joking. Like, of course, which is kind of, in the same field as like gaslighting. You're telling somebody's feeling something bad and then you're telling them, well, no, you shouldn't feel bad. It was just a joke. And so the person on the receiving end is not sure of the experience that they're having anymore because they're feeling bad. You're telling them it's just a joke. And the second type of microaggression is micro insults. And these are something that typically, a comment that is made unintentionally, and sometimes, can be seen as a compliment or, the one I think, and this has to do with gender, we talked a lot about culture, but this is not limited to culture. I think about gender, for example, and when I was younger, I used to be able to throw really fast takeouts. And somebody used to say, oh, you throw really well for a girl. And it's, it's not inherent. It's almost supposed to be a compliment, like, oh, you're better than the others. But it also feels like, well, you're lesser than a man, or you're not supposed to be throwing this hard. And the third category is micro invalidations. And so these sorts of comments are like, racism doesn't exist today. We're inclusive here. I don't see color, I don't see race. And so these are, what I wanted to do with these is mostly just, I think microaggressions are starting to be more common, but I don't know that we're talking about them enough and the impact that they have on people. And so just bring to light that these sorts of small comments that that are one-off or that might feel like it's nothing to you is actually a lot for other communities. And also talking, and I keep saying we'll talk about being an ally, but part of being an ally is being able to call out those comments when you hear them and say, actually, that's not okay. I don't want, you can't say that, or, using your privilege as a voice for somebody who is marginalized is a huge step of what it will look like to change the landscape of curling. And the last thing, and this is my last slide before talking about putting things into practice, I wanted to talk a little bit about grassroots change and what that means. We use the word grassroots change a lot, but what does that actually mean? The first is grassroots change requires group mobilization. That means that it can't be done alone. It can't be done in a silo. It means that you need to be actively talking about the change that you want to see with your peers, with the people in power. It needs to become embedded in your community. And so that's the third point is, this is very much from the literature in social psychology. There are 3 tenets that come out of grassroots change. So group mobilization, community involvement, and the other one is awareness and education. And you'll see that in this presentation today, I spent a lot of time on the awareness and education, and that's my bias, is really, can I talk about the things I know really well about to people who might know a little bit less than I do, so that we can create change together. And so, one form of grassroots change would be talking to somebody about the presentation you heard today. What is the one takeaway that you've heard from my presentation that maybe you didn't know, or that made you think? And that's the way that is an organic, inexpensive, not costly way to start getting the message around. And that's really what we talk about when we talk about grassroots change. And when I started being interested in activism and change, somebody reminded me, people are not going to participate in something they don't understand. And that has always stuck with me, and it shapes the way I talk about this. Is this topic is huge. It's daunting. We're asking people to change the way they've been forever. Let's take the time to explain why these changes are important, in a way that makes sense to them. And maybe it's reframing things. It's maybe giving examples that they're familiar with, or thinking about those examples from your own curling club. Yeah, to me, if I had to choose one of these that I would focus on, I would really encourage awareness and education, because it's something that you can be doing in your day-to-day life. And so finally, I will talk about putting this into practice. And so the first point I want to talk about is being an ally. And so there's this little acronym that spells ally. And so the first part of allyship to me is always center the impacted. So make sure that you're creating space for folks who have been marginalized, people of racialized communities, people who don't traditionally have a voice in the curling club. Make sure that we're making an explicit ask to hear their voices. Doesn't mean they have to do all the work. We don't want to be forcing education onto folks who spend their day educating. But we want to make sure that we're opening our ears and our eyes and our hearts to folks who have a story to tell, like you all are doing with me today. And in the same kind of vein, listen and learn from those who are living oppression. Leverage your privilege. So if you're somebody in the curling club who has privilege for different reasons, maybe you coach the juniors, or maybe you've been on the board, we're looking to you to help with this fight, and use your voice as somebody who has privilege to start the change. And then yield the floor is really making sure that if there's somebody who is part of a marginalized community who wants to talk, who wants to be there, make sure that you're creating space for them, even if it means you're taking a step back and you're making sure that you're echoing the voices of those who traditionally don't have a voice. That is probably the most important thing that you can do. There's also an emerging body of literature that looks at cultural competence in sports. And so the idea of cultural competence is we will never be experts, as a psychologist, I'm never going to be an expert on everybody's lived experience personally, but I can start to understand the different pieces of the human experience that I need to listen into and understand. And so it can be saying, I don't know what it's like to experience what you've experienced, but I'm here to learn. And so here are some of the common principles of cultural competence in sports. So the first is, what constitutes an appropriate physical space? And maybe that looks different for different people. Maybe shaking hands is not now it's not appropriate for everybody given COVID, but pre-COVID, maybe shaking hands is not comfortable for some folks. And starting to understand some of the things that we do about physical space that might make people feel uncomfortable or not safe is an important tenet of looking at cultural competence in sports. The other one I mentioned briefly is eating practices. Are there things that are, inherently exclusionary in the way that we are spending time eating together, or we're spending time drinking together? And what changes can we be making to those practices to make sure that we're more inclusive? Also thinking about scheduling and game times. If we are scheduling games at 5 p.m., if we want to have 3 leagues in one night and we start at 5 p.m., folks who are working 9 to 5 jobs can't come. And that is excluding a specific social class. If we think about people who are white collar versus blue collar, there's a socioeconomic difference in those folks. And so thinking about, at least at a club level, what are we doing to schedule games in a way that is accessible to everybody, will make a difference in the people who we're able to attract into the club. Also thinking, and I don't know a lot about this literature, but there are definitely cultural and cultural differences, but also safety and a trauma-informed lens around like averted versus sustained eye contact and what that looks like. And so, just understanding that small aspect of it makes a huge difference. There are people who are survivors of trauma or, of different cultures or different experiences, who might feel very uncomfortable with, North American or Western European eye contact practices, and how can we make small changes individually to make sure that we're making that inclusive for folks. And then the last piece is, thinking about appropriate dress, or at least, and I guess it's easy to say like in a curling club setting, like usually we're wearing a jacket and whatever, but I know that, for example, taking again my lived experience as, somebody who identifies as Muslim, I always get the question like, oh, like you're sleeping so hard, you're so warm, why aren't you wearing a short sleeve? And those sorts of things where like maybe that, culturally that doesn't work for me. And how do we make sure we're not asking those sorts of questions about these five, starting with these 5 principles as a way to make sure that sports in general, and specifically curling, have the cultural competencies that we need to be able to be more inclusive. This one is a big one. Change the culture. And I think, I am definitely aware, and I started with the individual be an ally slide because I know for sure that everybody in this group can walk away and read about and understand how to be an ally. I think we can start talking about cultural competence. I recognize that changing the culture is more than just what you are able to do on your own, but you can be part of the change. You can advocate for this change. We can advocate together for this change. And so I did want to bring it up, also recognizing that it's not necessarily just you and yourself who can make all these things. And so some of the things we don't want to talk about is establishing a sense of belongingness for everyone and understanding that that won't happen overnight, but that the ultimate goal is for everybody to feel like they belong in a curling club. And what does that look like? The other thing that is important, I would say is really important to remember, is that quotas don't automate inclusion. It's not because you have 20% racialized folks in your curling club that your club is now inclusionary. It's more than that. We spoke about before, having a seat at the table, making sure that decision makers are parts of communities who haven't traditionally had a voice. That's when we'll start talking about inclusion, not necessarily just because they're more diverse folks. Remembering that inclusion is ongoing. There's this conception a lot in the corporate world that, we'll do an unconscious bias training for our folks for 2 hours and suddenly they will know how to, talk about diversity. And that's not true. This will be something that we will talk about for the next, hopefully the rest of my life at least. It's something that will be ongoing. Hopefully we'll see change, but it's something that we'll need to continue to fight for. So it's not, I'll do one outreach activity and I'll stop. Or I'll do one like cultural thing and I'll stop. It's about keeping that fight ongoing that will create sustained change. And the other thing is language matters. And, I saw in the word cloud about the people who are in the curling club. I saw, heteronormative or heterosexual. And so and it's definitely true of what I see. And I was listening, as I was writing this presentation and thinking about these things, I was listening to TSN in Canada and was listening to curling. And I remember Cheryl Bernard said something like, oh, all these women with their husbands. And then I thought about it and I was like, I can't believe that, in this day and age, these elite athletes are being assumed that they all have husbands or, and I was so angry about it. And all this to say, language matters. The way we talk about people, the way we address people, the assumptions that we make about people in the language that we use will influence whether or not people feel included or feel like they can be included. The same thing about, asking for people's pronouns or talking about what pronouns are. And, that could be a talk in and of itself, talking about gender diversity. And that's something that is so far away from being achieved in a curling club. But I didn't do it today. And I think, in my mind, I was a curling talk, I don't need to do it. But at work, for example, or in other presentations, I start with saying, hi, my name's Sarah, my pronouns are she, her. And I welcome other people to share what what their pronouns are, so that we as allies can make sure that we are making space for folks who want to be, who are traditionally marginalized, who have long time fought to be legitimized in their identity and so yes, I could do a whole presentation about language matters, but starting to be mindful about the way you ask these sorts of things, like, I think, and this can apply to the curling club, it applied on TSN, but also, coming up and saying, oh, like, do you have a boyfriend, or being the young person at the curling club. I don't know how many times, us young juniors were like, the older people were always like, oh, like, do you have a crush on Steven? And it's like, well, what if, what if I don't have a crush on boys? And it's just something that is super prolific in curling. And so understanding how we talk about things matter. And the last thing that I have, one of the last things I have, is talking about organizational change. And I'm bringing this up as the last slide because I really want to focus on things that, you could take away with as a participant in this talk, to feel like you can do something, because I truly believe that each and every one of us can do something. From an org perspective, I think we can start talking about diversifying payment options. I don't know if this is at every curling club. At my curling club, you need to pay one check up front, and one check for hundreds of dollars. And that is inherently exclusionary. It costs a lot of money to curl, like we said earlier. And so thinking about how do we create diversity in the way people can access the club, and maybe there are subsidies, maybe, one model that I had seen previously in a different sporting organization is that you could pay an extra $10 on your membership to pay for a membership for somebody who didn't have the money to pay for a membership. And starting those initiatives within your curling club will be able to pay for, for be it Little Rock programs for people who might want to curl but don't have the money, for adults who want to be part of the curling club but are having a hard time. And starting those initiatives are something that, feels very grassroots. Ideally, it's something that becomes systemic, but we can start this at a curling club level. Also talking about community partnerships. There are allies in the community, there are groups who would love to probably come try to curl and then stay and learn, and thinking about who those people are. Are we going down the street to the Catholic school that's next to the curling club, or can we go into, in Montreal, for example, if we go into the more inner city, we can get out a lot more diverse populations. Can we bring them out to the curling clubs? Can we talk with them about, like, can we arrange a bus for you to come? And working with community partners that, traditionally haven't had the occasion to learn what curling is. And that's a lot of the problem too, is we cater to white folks. And so how do we start, diversifying the people that we are reaching out to? But then when they do come into the club, making sure that our practices are not exclusionary. So matching what we were saying earlier with this now, it can't be one or the other, it needs to be together. And this is a point, acknowledging that this is a systemic problem. The reality is that curling is not currently inclusive. Curling is not currently diverse. And for us to be able to say that, and for the leaders of our sports and different sporting bodies to be able to say that's when the change will really start. Maybe that we aspire to be, or we think we are, but the reality is we aren't. And that is a huge step towards change. The other thing is, the reality is that we're not necessarily going to change everything with folks who have been in the curling club for 50 and 60 years and who've grown up there. But one thing we can do is work really closely with the new generation of youth to be able to involve them in a sport. And youth who have never been involved in the sport before, who don't have family ties to the sport. It's interesting when people ask the question of, young curlers is, well, who in your family is a member of the club? And I remember everybody used to say, my grandfather and my mother and my father. And I was always like, nobody. Like, I found this ad in the newspaper and, like, I wanted to try curling and I tried curling, but how do we make that the norm? How do we make sure that youth are getting excited about curling and involved in curling, and making sure those programs are accessible? Maybe it's in an after school program as opposed to a Saturday. Maybe we have a partnership with a school or a community organization or a grant that will make it a lot less expensive to come curling. Maybe we can, maybe we have old brooms and I know that, I've gone through brooms over the years, and I always bring the brooms back to the junior program and give them to the youth who don't have them. And those small things that you can do to help, maybe it's an old broom to you, but this young kid is now having this really cool broom. And now they're going to want to come to curling every Sunday because they have something that they feel belongs to them. And so starting to think about how do we involve youth in that way in our programming is another important piece. And then the last thing I think a lot about, and I talked about it, is, scholarships and community investment. And this is, from an org level, and also, like we said, are there things that we can be doing, maybe the 50-50s as opposed to going to a charity? Can we reinvest that into a curling club specifically for marginalized folks who might not have an opportunity to curl in the first place? And the last slide that I have is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. These discussions are hard. They're emotionally exhausting for a lot of folks, especially those who had lived experience, and making sure that you're taking a look, making sure you're feeling that you can take a look within yourself, ask questions about yourself, admit being wrong, and change is definitely the way we are going to make change. And so I'm going to leave my email here and my name. Invite you to reach out, ask questions. Hopefully, Monica, I didn't spend all the time talking and we have some time for questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you if you have, we went a little bit over, so if you have time to answer questions, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I definitely have another half hour or whatever. So yeah, happy to ask questions. Thank you all for listening. I hope you've learned something, and I also hope that you're as passionate about this as I am. But thank you. I don't know, should I stop sharing my screen, Monica, and I can see people better?
Sure.
Or I want to see people?
That's fine. Yeah, feel free for those who are with us still to, raise your hand if you have a question or type it into the chat. We did have one. Sabina asked, are there any summary resources for cultural competence in sports? So,
are there summary resources? There are. How do I answer this? Can I just answer it loud?
Yeah, just feel free to answer. Yeah.
Maybe. I have, so there are different, so there are ones, I know the Canadian Centre for Gender Diversity has worked really hard on a project lately around LGBTQ youth in sports, and some tips about being inclusion, like looking at gender diversity from an inclusionary standpoint in sports. And then there's also the Canadian Centre for I can't remember. Canadian Centre for for ending discrimination. Anyways, maybe Monica, I can send them. If I send you a couple links, maybe you can put them in the newsletter or something like that.
Yeah, anything you want to send, we can get that out to people. So no rush on thinking of that on the top of your head. We can.
But Sabina, I also have some some more researchy articles that talk about cultural competence in sports.
Awesome. Sarah, do you want to stop sharing your screen? And I'm going to, we have someone raising their hand. I'm going to actually bring everybody into the panel.
Cool.
So we can all talk, because it's this relatively small group at this point.
Yeah.
And Jeff was the one who had the question, so he can go ahead whenever he's ready.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey everyone, thank you, Sarah, so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you in person. I know we communicated by email as a group a few weeks ago, but I wanted to ask you about one thing I remember about, and I grew up on the East Coast of Canada in Halifax, and I was a member of the Mayflower Curling Club, which is a big, well-known curling club on the East Coast. And one of the things I remember was curling in a Sunday afternoon league with my dad and my uncle. And right after us was a gay league. And at that time I was closeted and not open about my sexual identity. But I remember seeing that and thinking, and that was probably in 2009 or 10, maybe I want to say. And I think that one thing that I've seen in curling is that they have, there's been a growing sort of group of LGBTQ individuals who have been participating in curling. We have a Canadian Gay Curling Championship. And so, but it's interesting, I was always interested in them sort of participating in their own league together, right? You know, sort of building that community within the greater curling club. And I didn't really know how it worked at the time, but I believe they just rented the ice for 2 hours, and you know, they would socialize upstairs afterwards, but it was kind of their own thing. So what do you think about, or sort of what in your research sort of speaks to those almost like little sub communities that might exist within a curling club, and how that can sort of, how those communities might be able to sort of, you know, be more immersed in the whole club as a whole, or is it sort of better to have them sort of operate in their own space?
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's a really good question. And I think it's something I've thought a lot about. I don't know that I have the right answer. I think it's a really good introduction into like the sport in a safe space. You know, and it's very low risks, low stakes for somebody who maybe wants to go try it out and is afraid that, you know, somebody will say something derogatory, something, you know, especially with groups who have a long history of trauma. I think it's not necessarily a bad idea to have these spaces that we know are safe spaces for people to come try things out. And I feel like it might be like a stepping stone, you know, so a way to get people in a way that feels safe. And then, but not stopping there, you know, that isn't enough in my eyes. Maybe, you know, maybe some of the folks who play on the Sunday morning play, you know, like an inter-squad game against some of the folks in the afternoon. And that's how, you know, you sit around after for, you know, coffee and tea or a drink, and that's the slight introduction. And then they see that, you know, this is an environment they'll feel safe in, and then they join a league. And so I think it's not actually a bad idea to have that as a stepping stone, as long as we're aware that that's the first step. And then the ideal would be that, you know, the whole club would be a safe space. But I also recognize that it may not be the case right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of a similar question from me about the drinking example. When you brought that up, you kind of mentioned how, you know, drinking can be a really great thing. It makes people more comfortable in social situations, you know, fosters community, but it can be a negative thing. It can make people feel a little bit uncomfortable if they don't want to partake in it. Do you have any suggestions on how to navigate things like that, where there's both a good and a bad side, and it's not necessarily a right or a wrong thing, but just how to navigate that, I guess?
Yeah, something we tried out in the curling club that I'm in this year was there's like a chalkboard that we put in. It's like the drink of the week, and it costs a little bit less. And we always had one that was like alcoholic, one that was like virgin. And we found that a really good way of, you know, it was advertised, and two, people could just very easily say like, oh, this one sounds cool, I'll try it. And it became less about the alcohol and kind of the like coolness of the drink. And so starting to kind of socialize discussions about drinks that are not necessarily around alcohol, you know, it's a really small thing, but suddenly people, you know, maybe even people who are drinking will want to try it because it looks cool. And, you know, like the bartender would have fun trying to come up with these drinks that they could make that were non-alcoholic. And it was a really fun way to get creative about, you know, about drinking, and making it less daunting of just like, I'm taking the boring Perrier or whatever. But it becomes something that's fun, and it's something that like a subject of discussion. And, you know, we ended up having tons of good discussions about the non-alcoholic drink that was on the board, and not because it was non-alcoholic, but because it was fun. And so that's that's the one that comes to mind when I think about, you know, things to do. I think, you know, there's also the ways to ask, you know, can I buy you a drink? Is not necessarily linked to alcohol, but it definitely has the connotation. And so, you know, starting to think, and I don't have the language necessarily yet about it, but, you know, some people, you know, when they knew I didn't drink would say like, can I buy you a juice, you know? And that felt nice, because it was like, you know, it felt like somebody was making a step in the right direction. And they weren't making assumptions, because you know, I'd known them for years and years. But maybe changing the language, and, you know, goes back to language matters, is there something that we can do to change a little bit of the way we ask those questions to make it more open in the first place, so that we're not, you know, we're not putting somebody into a box to be like, now I have to tell you why I don't drink, and it's a lot. And so yeah, that's what my thoughts are for now.
Yeah, honestly, you're so smart. I wish we did this already. Like, it's a no-brainer to me. And also I'm sure Sarah and I would love to have you back for a language talk sometime if you're interested. think about it.
I'll definitely, I'm not going anywhere. I'm excited to keep working.
Just on the flip side of the drink conversation, I for a long time would just because it was the norm, I would buy people drinks, and then I got to the point where my teammates would buy them drinks, and I would like buy my teammates dinner or something, and then I got to the point where I guess I was comfortable enough in myself that I realized I don't have to buy somebody else alcohol, but that took a long time for me. And so I started just offering, after games, can I offer you something non-alcoholic to drink? So some people to this day in the club that I've curled in for 17 years, I still get dirty looks sometimes. I still get some weird comments sometimes. But most people have gotten to the point where they're like, if they want something alcoholic, they'll get it themselves. Otherwise, they'll tell me something non-alcoholic. But I really like your fun non-alcoholic drink idea. But I think there's still a cultural shift that will take a generation at least for people to not expect you. And maybe it's just an Eastern Ontario, Quebec type thing, but maybe like that it's going to take time for people to realize that they are not what's the word I'm looking for, basically it's not a right.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. Thank you for sharing your experience and bringing that up. The other thing, I don't know if this is the norm in all curling clubs, we also have snacks. So sometimes people will buy me like a bag of chips or something like that. And so there's also that could be, like, can I buy you a snack? That could be a way of, of incorporating something that feels more inclusive. And I don't know what the norms are in all curling clubs, but it's definitely the case here in Quebec. I see somebody has their hand. Maggie?
Yeah, go for it, Maggie.
It was just a comment really on the culture change on drinking. So in Scotland, maybe 5 years ago, they changed the drink driving laws. So essentially, it's zero tolerance. It's essentially if you have a small glass of wine and you get pulled over, you're in big trouble. And there was a lot of discussion in the ice rinks thinking, oh, how's that going to affect us? And actually, it's amazing how quickly the culture's changed. And some of these conversations about people expecting an alcoholic drink after a game, it really struck me that we thought that was going to be a massive challenge, but now it's the norm to have a non-alcoholic drink, and the social side is still there. So I think it's really impressed me how quickly that culture's changed, and I know it's for different reasons, but I think there's hope for the future that the curling club can still have that excellent social environment without the need to have an alcoholic drink.
That's really awesome to hear. I'm wondering, the argument I hear often, in my curling club is that the bar revenues are so important to be able to sustain the curling club. And so I'm also mindful of that, of that piece of it, of the economic need. So has that had an impact, or is that something that's talked about?
Yes, it is, but I think the margins on coffee and the soft drinks, that's still a decent revenue, and I think it almost encourages us to make sure we have a drink, even if you take one to have in the car, if you can't stay for the social side, and support the club in that way. And I think if it's more the norm to have a soft drink, then that's acceptable too, to say I need to nip off, I can't stay and chat, but I'll take a can with me, because it would be weird to take a beer with you. In fact, it's illegal to do that here. So I think there's changes can be made there, and you're right, the importance of having a drink, not just for the social side, but for the financial side of the club.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Does anyone have anything else? One thing I wanted to say actually is I really appreciate your point about having different payment tiers for curling clubs. That's something I don't see a lot of currently where I am, at least. And I think it's important to note that that doesn't take away from the valuation of the club, because I know a lot of curling clubs are thinking about the value of their club and are maybe underselling themselves in terms of membership currently. But I think there's a way to kind of accomplish both reach the full evaluation of the curling club while also providing different payment structures for different people. So I thought that was a really good point.
I wonder if ever, this is the dream, but I know what I do, like as a clinical psychologist who sees clients, is that I have a sliding scale. So, depending on what folks are making, they're paying different hourly rates. And I don't know if that model could be replicated large scale in terms of, membership and making sure that it's equitable, but also that folks who might not be able to pay for the full membership can pay for something, can pay what they're able to pay.
Agreed. I also really liked your point about the TSN announcers during the ongoing championships. I've noticed a lot of kind of minor things. The kind of traditional family unit that's being put out there quite a bit in comparison to, say, I think there were a couple curlers who put a photo on social media of themselves with a pride flag, and there was a lot of kind of negative backlash around that. So it's just interesting to see the differences there. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that here. Similarly, there was a comment about, I think I tweeted about this, the mixed doubles berth that the Canadian announcers seem to think that they should automatically get, and just maybe shifting perspective a little bit that, all countries need to earn their way on the ice. So language, like you said, is really important. And that's been a great example, the ongoing championship announcing that I've been listening to.
Yeah, Sabina, I think you have your hand up. Is that right?
I just had a question about like tokenism. So I know for a lot of initiatives, people who are, I guess the diverse community is usually handpicked to sit on a lot of committees and be part of the conversation. So I'm very happy to be part of the conversation and help, but I am by no means an expert of every cultural or racial group out there, and you almost feel pressure to represent everybody because you're the only one at the club who looks different.
Yeah.
So how do you because that's why I wanted some of those resources, because even within the Muslim community, there's so much, there's such a variance. So I don't want to try to pretend that I know everything. So these resources are really important. And how do you be a part of it, because you don't want to not be at the table, but then do everybody justice when you're, I want to help, but I want to make sure that I'm doing justice to the groups, to all the different groups out there.
Yeah, I don't know that I have the right answer. I have gotten into the habit of starting, this is part of my job, and so I do it all the time. But I've gotten into the habit of starting my talks, kind of like today with this is my lived experience, let me tell you a little bit about myself, and this is unique to my experience, and starting that conversation of, I identify as a Muslim Moroccan Canadian who has had this experience, and by no means do I represent, Muslims in general, for example. And starting off with that premise, I find helps a lot. And, it's a lot of doing that, putting caveats, and it takes work, right? Saying, this is my experience. It might not be everybody's experience, but, centering yourself as an individual with lived experience, as opposed to a representative of the community, and trying to stay away from on behalf of, Muslim people, or on behalf of this, no, you can talk on behalf of yourself, and that's about it. You're an expert on your own lived experience. And so that's how I tend to navigate it. I also think from a club level, I've seen this in a workplace too, where I've been asked to be on a task force, and it's the CEO has appointed you to a task force because you're part of the diverse community. And I'm like, no, you don't get to say whether I think, that this is where I get to be appointed. And so being careful, wanting to have that seat at the table, but making sure from the club level saying, you know, maybe saying, you know, we encourage everybody, but, you know, and putting, you know, we're particularly interested in traditionally marginalized and racialized voices. And so putting that caveat in, but making sure that it's people who are coming to the table because they want to, and they feel like they have the capacity to, and, you know, they're emotionally equipped to do it because it's a lot of work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff, I see you have your hand up.
Oh yeah, thanks. I just wanted to chime in. I also want to say, Sabina, what you were talking about was really important. And I'm going to be doing a webinar in a couple of weeks on especially looking at, you know, how to bring people in staffing wise and from a board level and volunteers and staff, and sort of that's an important thing that we have to consider, is that token aspect. And so I hope to share some thoughts a little bit more about that in a few weeks. But I did want to speak quickly about what Monica said with regards to the language on the TV broadcast. And actually there's research out there that shows that, in particular, I think it was NCAA biographies online of head coaches, and they, you know, were way more apt to include the information about an opposite sex partner than they ever were to about somebody, a coach, an assistant coach, whoever it was, that had a same sex partner. So it's, you know, in a lot of these places, it's, you know, we still have sort of those heteronormative type beliefs, and it's very hard to sort of break through. But I think the media plays the key role in that. And what was interesting, I did notice the same thing. You know, they talked a lot about the traditional family units, and you know, Laura Walker was there, you know, with Jeff there looking after her baby, which is great to actually see. You know, the husband was taking care of the child so that the woman could be participating in high performance sport, which was great. But it's still that traditional family unit. And what was interesting was that we did have a number of openly gay curlers curling at the Briar, and you know, there was no real special segment on that. There was no specific mention of, you know, and I don't think that they showed the John Epping and Greg Smith game on TV. It wasn't a live game. And I do believe that they may have mentioned something briefly, but that was a pretty big moment in sport in Canada. And I think, and like you say, it was talked about on Twitter and it got some negative feedback. So I think that that was an opportunity for the media to maybe speak up a little bit and to sort of show its support. And I think that they did fail at that. And I think, you know, those are just little ways, you know, it's, again, it's kind of like those microaggressions. It's things, you know, it's kind of like keeping it invisible, or not necessarily bringing it up when it's important to bring it up in the moment and sort of share that. You know, there were technically, I think there were actually 3 openly gay curlers at the Briar, because Dustin Kidby, the lead for Saskatchewan, is also openly gay. And there was a big feature on him a couple of years ago. But again, you know, to have 3 of them in a national championship, I mean, I thought was pretty amazing. And for me, it just didn't get the kind of exposure and it was a real opportunity, I think, for both Curling Canada and the host broadcaster TSN to really do something about it. And I think they just kind of dropped the ball. And that's people, you know, people notice that.
Yeah, I think when people don't speak, like, it speaks louder than when they do. Like, the exclusion that you feel when people are not speaking up when they actually have the opportunity feels just as bad as somebody who's, you know, inherently being or like explicitly being exclusionary. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm also like very involved in the gymnastics community, which has nothing to do with this, but in the NCAA side of things, there were no openly, you know, LGBTQ community members. And then they started talking about it, and they started having pride meets in, you know, almost every NCAA school. And now there are, you know, 15 or 20 schools that have students who are openly part of the LGBTQ community. And it takes those, you know, first brave people who are able to speak up. And then like it's interesting because it's like when we come together as a group like this, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many people like me who exist. And we don't have the opportunity to talk about it because we're all like in our own corners, like nervous about talking about our own experiences. And so making sure that if you feel capable of using your voice in one way or another, that you're doing that, I think is great and super important.
This has been a really good discussion. Does anybody have any last kind of things they'd want to say before we end?
Just wondering about Jeff's webinar. Is it through this program or is it? Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Very good. Thanks.
I can send you the invite if you like. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh no, I was just gonna mention, I think it's April, what is the date on it? It's 14th or 15th, I think.
Yeah.
14th.
The link is in our latest
Newsletter.
And I'll also be posting about it on social media too, so keep an eye out. Sarah, did you have any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with? This was awesome.
I just thank you. I think I am like super filled with gratitude for the opportunity to do this, to Sarah and to Monica, but also to you folks who listened to me and have shared your experiences. I'm really excited for what the future of curling has to look like, and I'm excited to do this work with you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.